Romans. The Batavians had long enjoyed exemption from taxation in exchange for providing a disproportionate share of the auxiliary troops stationed along the Rhine, but as Vitellius ascended to the throne, his agents pressed the Batavians to contribute even more troops to help reinforce the Rhine. This was the last straw for the Batavians, who were already ticked off at the empire for a number of other recent slights, and in the guise of helping Vespasian win the throne, Julius Civilis led his people in revolt. He helped pin down the 2 legions left on the Lower Rhine, and thus did indeed help Vespasian's war effort. But when the Flavians emerged victorious, and Civilis refused to lift his siege, it became apparent that the Batavians were fighting for themselves alone. Elsewhere in Gaul, a Belgic leader who claimed to be the great-grandson of Julius Caesar led his own revolt, and managed to convince the 2 legions garrisoning the area to come over to his side. With the whole region up in arms and expecting little relief, the commanders of the 2 legions besieged by Civilis surrendered in early 70 AD. But contrary to the promise of safe passage they had received, the 2 disarmed legions were massacred. Obviously, Rome could not stand for such an atrocity, and the shocked Vespasian, who had already promised the Batavians independence as a reward for their help against Vitellius, ordered a massive army north to crush the rebellion. Civilis planned to keep fighting, but when word came that Jerusalem had fallen, he knew that the handwriting was on the wall. The Batavian leader had been counting on the continued Roman preoccupation in the east to help him avoid the full brunt of the empire's attention. But now that he knew that he and his countrymen were the only things blipping on Vespasian's radar, it was time to give up. The Batavians surrendered and agreed to return to the terms of their original treaty, along with a whole host of new restrictions and obligations. Beyond the unrest of his first years in office, the empire was relatively quiet throughout Vespasian's reign. The only major action thereafter took place in Britain, which we'll cover more extensively next week as it spanned the reigns of Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian. We are blessed to have a full accounting of the campaigns in Britannia, as Tacitus married the daughter of the principal Roman commander Julius Agricola, and chose his father-in-law as the subject of his first major historical work, known as the Agricola. Vespasian, as I said, was the first emperor in quite some time to die of natural causes, which is a testament to the esteem with which he was held. That is not to say that various attacks weren't made on his life, just that none were able to get close enough to be dangerous. The Praetorians remained loyal, and top commanders refused to get caught up with plots to overthrow a popular ruler. I will mention, though, as an epilogue to the Year of the Four Emperors, that one of the men who did attempt to assassinate Vespasian was none other than Caecina, who was apparently hardwired to betray whatever master he served. Despite earning Vespasian's favor during the war, by 79, Caecina was up to his old tricks again. For unknown reasons, he conspired to kill the emperor, but the plot was discovered, and the habitual turncoat was finally executed by Titus. Vespasian survived all of this easily, but by June of 79, his health began to slip. At 69 years old, he was not a young man anymore, and knew that his time was at hand. He had brought Titus in to share the burden of empire years before, and was confident he was handing power over to a capable man who could rule for many years, at least long enough for him to sire his own son and keep power away from Vespasian's other son Domitian, a young man of dubious character. On June 23, 79 AD, Vespasian lay on his deathbed. But rather than simply fading away, he demanded that he be helped out of bed, declaring that an emperor should at least die on his feet. According to the legend, his last words, spoken while enduring the painful throes of death, were, "Dear me, I must be becoming a god." Vespasian died at the age of 69, after ruling Rome for 9.5 years. Vespasian's reign is generally seen as a successful one, and I see no reason to contradict the consensus. His naturally mild temperament, pragmatic policies, and skillful use of propaganda allowed normalcy to return to an empire shaken by civil war. In almost every way, he left Rome better than he had found it. And as Tacitus said, he was probably the only man who improved his own character upon taking office. This rustic and obscure general had gone far higher than he had any right to expect, and he had clearly risen to the occasion. Not only that, but Titus had risen to the occasion along with his father, and despite some initial misgivings about their new emperor, the people of Rome quickly embraced Titus and began to hail the new Flavian dynasty as the answer to all their problems. Unfortunately, Titus would last only a scant 2 years in office before succumbing to disease, and soon enough, the Romans would be introduced to the dark half of the Flavian coin. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you now know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 60,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again is audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for the 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book that you downloaded. You can also keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all future audiobook purchases. The Jewish Wars by Josephus, the Jewish historian who attached himself to the Flavians after being captured in battle during the Great Jewish Revolt. Though he is clearly biased in favor of Vespasian and the other Flavians, his history forms the basis for much of our understanding of the period. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 74, Friends, I Have Wasted a Day. Titus Flavius Vespasianus, the eldest son of Vespasian, ascended to the throne in June 79 AD, following the sad but not entirely unexpected death of his father. The Roman world had settled down considerably under Vespasian's moderate influence, and though there may have been a few scattered anxieties concerning the transfer of power, after all, it had been 25 years since power had last been transferred peacefully, no one arose to challenge Titus, who was, in every way, the legal and logical heir to the throne. In fact, most people were not worried at all about whether the transition from Vespasian to Titus would be peaceful, but rather whether Titus would follow in his father's mild footsteps, or whether he would become a tyrant drunk with power. Because though he is remembered today for continuing the pragmatic moderation of his father, and possibly even besting him in the department of generosity, when the almost 40-year-old Titus was hailed as Augustus, there were very real fears that, despite his age, he would prove himself to be another Nero. But before we get too deep into the biography of Titus, I want to double back and hit on something I left hanging last week when I was describing the relative peace of Vespasian's reign. Though the revolts in Judea and Gaul were put down soon after Vespasian took office, the one theater of war that remained active throughout most of his reign, and into those of his sons, was up in Britannia. We know this, as I said last week, because the commander who led most of the campaigns in the north had the good sense to marry his daughter to a world-class historian. As a result, we probably know more about what Gnaeus Julius Agricola was up to during the reign of Vespasian than we know about what the emperor himself was up to. Agricola was born on the southern coast of Gaul in 40 AD into a family of senatorial rank on both sides. He did not get to know his father very well, however, as the elder Agricola was executed by Caligula for refusing to prosecute someone who had raised the mad emperor's ire. The younger Agricola escaped Caligula's wrath, and when he turned 18, he began his public career by getting shipped off in 58 AD to the island that would define his life. Agricola arrived in Britannia just in time to serve as a military tribune on the general staff during Boudicca's revolt. When the uprising was put down, Agricola was transferred to the province of Asia, and it was while in the east that his wife gave birth to Julia Agricola, future wife of our old friend Tacitus. Back in Rome, after his term expired in 66, he managed to escape the year of the 4 emperors with his head intact, but was crushed to learn that Otho's marauding naval force had killed his mother while they sacked the Gallic coast. Probably blaming both Otho and Vitellius alike for causing the war that had killed his mother, Agricola eagerly joined the Flavians the first chance he got. Vespasian recognized Agricola's promise, and after taking office, assigned him to lead a legion in Britannia, a province the young man was already well acquainted with. The imperial administration on the island had been plunged into a state of disarray by the recent civil wars, with the various legionary commanders being pulled different directions, but all the while remaining too far away to do anything about or keep up with the rapid-fire changeover of power down in Rome. A dissident faction of Brigantes, the largest pro-Roman tribe on the island, decided to take advantage of the situation and overthrew their collaborating queen, who, just to bring things back around, was the same queen who had once upon a time handed Caradicus to the Romans when the resistance leader came looking for sanctuary in 51. Suddenly, the Romans' greatest ally became their greatest threat, and when he took over, Vespasian appointed a vigorous governor to get the situation back in hand, and the governor in turn appointed Agricola to spearhead the repacification. From 71 to 75, Agricola crisscrossed Brigantes' territory, attempting to bring it back to heel. He was successful, but not definitively, and the region would continue to plague the empire for years to come. Eventually, the Emperor Hadrian would build the wall that bears his name, in part to separate the Brigantes from supply lines and allies in Scotland. After receiving a promotion to a governorship in Gaul in 75, and then serving in Rome as a consul, Agricola returned to Britannia for a third time in 78, this time as the provincial governor, a post he would hold for an unusually long 7 years. The new governor's first task was to retaliate against one of the eternally difficult Welsh tribes who had annihilated a Roman cavalry garrison and were now openly flouting Roman rule. Agricola swept in and easily crushed the offending tribe and restored firm Roman control of the region in the process. The whole province had been suffering from a string of disinterested Roman administrators who were likely no more happy about being stuck in Britain than the locals were about being stuck with them. But Agricola was determined to remind everyone, Romans and British alike, that the empire was here to stay. He quickly gained a reputation as a strict administrator of both unruly locals and unruly legionaries, but no one could deny that he was always honest in his dealings with both his soldiers and the tribes they watched over. In an effort to further entrench Roman civilization on the island, Agricola instituted programs to educate the sons of the local nobility in proper classical fashion, exposing them to ideas far beyond what their parents could possibly understand, and hopefully turning the next generation of leaders into true Roman citizens, rather than leaving them as uncouth provincials. He also tried to replace the messily organic town centers with the straight-lined rationality of Roman city planning. His theory was that if the British locals thought like Romans and lived like Romans, pretty silly idea anyway. Agricola's vision of a fully Romanized Britain never did come to fruition, but it was not for a lack of trying. In a few short years, Agricola would find himself leading an army north into Scotland in an attempt to bring the whole island under imperial control. Though he would defeat a combined force of some 30,000 Caledonians in 84 AD, and possibly marched all the way to